good to have everyone back today. We've heard lots of happy people from our yoga and qigong and meditation sessions. So we hope you had an opportunity to share in those practices, and thank you for being back with us here on the main stage. So our next conversation is titled Embracing Fear in the Age of COVID, Politics, and Race. Eldra is a writer and sought-after public speaker on the topics of at-risk youth advocacy, effective criminal justice rehabilitation, and turning around toxic masculinity. Eldra Jackson is the co-executive director of Inside Circle, the nonprofit training organization he credits with saving his life. He's going to be in conversation with Soren, and I promise we chose the right conversation to start your day.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and welcome, Eldra. It's good to have you here. We've got a lot to cover and really excited to have you. You're one of the people I think I most respect in the world who I've come across. And I feel like there's a lot going on in our culture right now and in society in general, and just really excited to dive into it. So thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Soren. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today.
When we were talking, ahead of this is about like how we're going to kind of structure some of this time. We were both talking about the recent killings that we had in Atlanta and at Boulder. And I think maybe we'll just start there because I think that represents a certain kind of division and a certain kind of stress and a certain kind of hatred, if you will, that's been underneath the surface in at least in the American society for some time. And I'm wondering, how do you see those events and how do we learn from some of those events to minimize the things like that happening further?
Well, first of all, I think that the way that we begin to address these issues is just by that, addressing these issues and not sweeping them under the rug. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, we've had events in Georgia and in Colorado that resulted in the tragic loss of 18 people. And when I say 18 people, I'm just numbering the direct victims of the crime, the direct victims who were so tragically lost their lives. We're not even naming their families. We're not speaking about the communities as a whole. We're not speaking about the generational effects of fear that will exist about going to work, about going to shop. You had people that were standing in line to get vaccinated for COVID-19. So I think first what we do is we honor those who have fallen, and we look at ourselves as a society. I look at myself as an individual to see, what is my role? What role do I play in this? What role have I played in this? When I see certain things, when I hear certain things, when I hear someone make reference to something like the Kung flu or the Chinese virus, what do I say? How do I show up? My silence can be permission for things like that to go on. My silence can be approval of those sorts of attitudes. So how do I show up? These are the questions that I need to be asking myself, because I have to take ownership over what I bring into the world and how I contribute to things.
Yeah. And I think this year has been a really challenging year for a lot of people. And the topic of fear is something that people have experienced in ways maybe that they didn't experience before, particularly fear of COVID and walking through stores and feeling like, oh shit, is this person gonna, like, am I gonna die because I took off my mask and hugged my parent or child or whatever, right? Like there's this fear that's been living in our lives. And I think there's also things that happened, in our culture where we saw Black Lives Matter starting to rise and so many killings and injustices that are done. And I'm curious, how do you work with fear that's come up? And I know you spent many years in prison, you spent many years in different environments that maybe weren't always so safe or so welcoming. How do you work with the fear in your life of like, oh shit, I could die, or whether it's because of a dangerous physical situation or whether it's because of a dangerous like health pandemic?
Mhm. The way that I have taken on dealing with fear is embracing the fact that it is an emotion. It's a part of the human condition. So I don't ever try to eliminate it. I
Mhm.
don't judge myself for experiencing it because it's going to arise just like joy is going to arise, just like sadness is going to arise. But what I try and do is manage it in a way so that it does not drive me, so that it is not the one that is in driving the purpose of my life. And I was taught an acronym long ago when I was in prison: fear, false emotions appearing real.
Mhm.
Usually when I am afraid, I am thinking about the past or I'm thinking about the future. Something that has already happened is affecting me, so it's not real. And I'm thinking about something that might happen,
Mhm.
which is in the future. It doesn't exist. It is not real. And so I try and come back to my center, which is the present moment, and evaluate what is it in this moment that is triggering this response in me?
Mhm.
What is it in this moment that needs to be dealt with? That's not saying that the fear is not real,
Right.
that it's not communicating to me that something is, it may need to be dealt with in this moment,
Right.
but what is the level of response in
Mhm.
this moment? Because if my fear is being triggered by something in the past, then however I needed to deal with the issue in the past might not be appropriate in this moment.
Mhm.
It might
Mhm.
not be enough and it might be too much. And in the past, that's gotten me in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I think it's true for all of us. I hear you. I hear you.
Yes, sir.
And when the fear arises, do you get curious about it? Do you welcome it? Do you learn from it? Because I think if you look at some of these underlying issues that we're facing in society, from some of the killings to the Capitol being stormed, a lot of these people are probably living in some level of fear, right? The fear is motivating them. They think the election was stolen, or they think this, or there's militias now, in different parts of the country who have guns and they're doing crazy stuff. And I think fear is at least get one of the qualities of the things underneath it. And how do you feel like we can begin to kind of shift our relationship to fear so that those don't become driving factors and we don't see all this what we're seeing today?
For me, in my experience, what I've learned is that acknowledging that it exists and then speaking to it. I think that a lot of the things that we've seen recently with politics, with the pandemic, around race issues, collectively we have fears, and individually, in my experience, I've had fear. And where it has shown up in an unhealthy way is I have succumbed to that fear and been afraid to voice it, been
Mm.
afraid to speak to it, been afraid to acknowledge it. And when I suppress that and I hold it, then it's easy for me to begin a narrative in my head about what's happening outside of myself.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then I start to respond to you out of that narrative,
Right.
because now you are a part of my running narrative. Now you are a symptom of the fear. And so
Right.
what do I do when I have symptoms? I look to eradicate them.
Right. Right.
And if you in that narrative are a part of that, then I'm going to eradicate you.
Right. Right. And I feel like if you look at least in the US history, we have there's a long history of injustice that many people feel, in particularly in certain communities. And they feel like they've been shut down and their voice has not been heard. And it's time to be heard, right? It's time to actually speak up so that people in more privileged positions, people who've been in more the dominant culture, can hear that and listen to that. Do you feel like how do you feel like the society changes and the person changes, or do you feel like it really comes back to the person first and the society then is just an expression of these people?
It comes down to the individual first. It comes down to the person first, because individuals make up the society, individuals make up the group think. And and I'll give you a little anecdote from myself, and hopefully this helps individuals. Uh, it's well documented that I've spent a great deal of time in California's penal institutions. I used to be involved in gang activity, and there's a sort of group thing that
Mhm.
goes on. in that culture and in our culture as a people. And within that group think, there's a herd mentality. And we get into a state of being where we just go along and we're not thinking. I'm not thinking. I'm just doing what I think I'm supposed to do, or what I've been trained I'm supposed to do, or what has been historically passed down to me about how I'm supposed to respond. Somebody steps on my foot and I'm supposed to slap the taste out of his mouth. Why? Because they say that's how it goes. Well, who is this they?
Mhm.
Who is the they that came up with this response for me? That might not work for me.
Yeah.
So when I began to question why I felt the way that I felt and why I was responding the way that I responded, and though the group was doing it, it wasn't working for me. I wasn't getting results in my life that I was happy with. I wasn't happy with myself as a person. So when I began to question those things and find my own purpose and find my own meaning and strike out on my own, it inspired other people to do the same.
Yeah.
And that's how we can alter groupthink and culture in society in a positive way, by thinking for ourselves, by me thinking for myself, finding a positive purpose for myself and moving in that direction.
Mhm.
Hopefully others start to do that for themselves and we come up with a new society. That's how we alter where we're at
Got it.
collectively.
Got it. And you look to yourself, and you look to your questions, and you look to your thoughts, and you look to your stories, and you look to how can I be a model for that, and kind of
Mhm,
live and be that versus tell other people to live and be that.
mhm,
Do you ever do? I know you go inside now and you work with men and women in prisons who've been through incredible trauma, incredible pain, and incredible journeys that in some ways are completely unfair. You know, what's the level of suffering that happens to certain people in their lives. And we've all gone through suffering, but I know these people work. I used to work in juvenile halls and prisons somewhat, and there's the stories in there. And so how do you create a space of healing for the men and the women that you work with, so that
honor them.
pain actually gets touched and doesn't then
Yes,
get recreated?
yes.
What do you find yourself doing that creates that environment, and what can we all do to create that environment in our homes and in our families?
Mhm. It begins with honoring the story, not mitigating the story, not trying to make the story less than, not trying to qualify it, and not attempting to compare it.
Okay.
And when I create a space where an individual feels like they're being heard, that in and of itself is cathartic, because oftentimes people who are suffering, people who are in adverse situations, feel like their voice is not being heard.
Yeah.
And when they are heard, when I create the space to hear you and to see you, now we're on a plane where healthy communication can begin
Yeah.
and healing can begin. That can't happen if I don't feel like I'm being seen, or if I don't feel like I'm being heard. So we have to come to a common ground where individuals feel like they're being seen and heard.
And how do you give them your full attention, and you try to notice the stories that you're telling yourself about whatever it is that they're doing? How do you bring that in? I guess I hear you, and I also wonder, like, all right, so like I'm listening to this story, and I'm like, man, that was a horrible thing that person did, or that was a horrible, and or the judgment. Like, I think there's a lot of divide in our country, and part of the titles is politics, right? There's the Trump
Mhm,
supporters, there's the Biden,
mhm,
Obama supporters. There's like people who like, I don't like, you're not in my club, like you're on the other team. And so when you find yourself listening to something and you don't like what you're listening to, or it's hard for you to listen to, how do you grapple with that? Or how do you relate to that? Do you feel like that's your own work on yourself?
That's definitely work on self. And there's a very thin line between hearing and listening. Hearing is something that anybody can do. Listening is a practice.
Mm.
Listening is noticing those things that you were just talking about where my mind wants to go, thinking about my response, waiting for an opportunity to jump in and add my 2 cents, or to create a space for a person to tell them that everything is all right, as opposed to being present and
Mm.
quiet and still
Mm.
and noticing what's going on with me while being with the other person and getting in tune energetically with the other person and being there for the other person so that they know that right now they're the only thing that matters.
Wow. Right. Because I can only imagine, particularly working inside prisons, there's probably stories and pains that people have had for 30, 40, 50 years they've never told anybody, right?
Mhm.
That's been hurt. And it's a vulnerable thing to be able to say, wow, this happened to me as a kid, this abuse or this experience that happened. And yet there's this tremendous healing that can happen, right? If it's in a supportive environment. But I think we've all built up these identities sometimes around our pain, right? To protect our pain, whether we're going to be strong or tough or what weak or whatever it is, right? We built up this protection. And yet what it seems like what you found is that when you go in there and you have this quality of listening and really taking in, that it invites something in that person that wants to come out to share and to maybe unveil what is hidden in there. Is that an accurate way of putting it?
Most certainly, what comes out of the individual who's being listened to is their true sense of self. If I don't feel like I'm being heard, if I don't feel like I am being seen, then why should I show myself?
Yeah.
I don't feel safe showing myself, hence the fear.
Yeah.
And so what I turn into is a constricted version of
Yeah.
who I can be, of
Yeah.
who I was meant to be. And
Yeah.
until I have the space to really open up and feel the freedom to be who I am, whatever that looks like, whatever my ego tells me that looks like, then I'm gonna continue to walk around constricted and constrained and wrapped
Yeah.
up in a tight ball.
Yeah, and this, I should say, this happens, at least from my experience, just as much on Wall Street or Silicon Valley boardrooms or anywhere else, right? That constriction, that feeling like I'm not good enough with who I am, and I have to do this thing, whether it's to be tough or make money, whatever it is, I've got to do this thing to be this special somebody. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, when do you know that the self is actually showing up, the true self? Like, can you feel it? Does it like have a quality to it? Like, how do we all know whether we're in that or we're in some other role?
When and the question that you're asking, how do I know when somebody else is in it, or how do
Or
I know
both?
when I'm in it?
Both. Maybe you first. How do you know when
Okay,
you're in it?
I know that I'm in that space first when I feel fear. And when I say fear, the fear is that you are going to see me.
Mm.
When I feel that fear, and then when I push past that, and there's a euphoria for myself that comes into play. There's a euphoria, and I feel a connection, and it's
Got it.
like you and I are one. We're dancing,
Yeah.
and it's very rhythmic, and there's music playing, and I can see colors like rain. It's otherworldly.
Got it. But and it seems like, at least from what I hear, it's like you can't get that experience if you're holding secrets, or if
Mhm.
you're not quite willing to share what's been true for you. Is that true? Like, what keeps us from that is like an inability or lack of capacity to be able to really tap in, and we can't get to that space unless we can really acknowledge everything that's happened to us and all the stories and the fears.
Mhm.
Is that your experience?
What you're speaking to is the fear around acceptance, the
Mm-hmm.
fear around my truth, and that feeds into the narrative of the other, and that
Yeah.
keeps us in that space of us versus them, me versus you, because the story that I'm telling myself is you can't handle all that I am. You
Yeah.
won't be able to accept everything that I am. So if I'm continuing to believe that, then I have fear about completely being who I am with you and allowing you the space to be completely who you are with me. So pretty much what I've just done is created a space where I have an enemy.
Yeah.
Though we may not be actively engaged in physical
Yeah.
combat, you are an adversary.
Yeah.
So yes, you are the other, and there are those divisive lines.
And that's in some ways a story of humankind so far, right? Whether it's immigrations or this country or the Russians or somebody, right? Or there's always somebody, right, that we other, and to create that. And how do you see, if you could control, if you were president or you had a magic wand or something, how do you see us moving beyond that into a different relationship with one another?
A different relationship with one another.
A different
What
relationship
works
with ourselves, I guess, to start with, but then a different
with
relationship with
ourselves
another.
and
Because
with
the story
others.
of humankind, right, has always been, you see, got Trump elected, and what was it? It was the immigrants, right? They're the ones that we need to fight against, or that somebody else is like, oh no, it's that everybody agrees the problem is not us, it's somebody else, right? And do you see a world where we can begin to soften some of those
Certainly I can see where we can begin to soften some of those things, because if we're in a position, if I'm in a position and I'm president of the United States, and I have all of these adversaries in the world who are an issue, who are a problem, then I'm going to ask them a very simple question: what do you need? And give them the space and the opportunity to be seen and to be heard, and ask them what they need, because maybe they don't know.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people are fighting and struggling and running and scrapping and feel like they need their voice heard. Give them space. What do you need?
Yeah. Wow. And is that, I can only imagine that question coming up, because I know you hold these circles. I know it's been hard during COVID, but you sit with men and women who've been in all kinds of pain and suffering, both they've experienced themselves and they've caused. And is that the question that you kind of helps guide you into a different relationship?
Yes, sir. What do you need? Because what that does is it provides the opportunity for an individual to slow down. Oftentimes people have not had the opportunity to really sit with themselves and look at what they need.
Yeah.
And if you haven't had that space, if you haven't had that opportunity, well, let's do that now.
Yeah.
And figure out what part of you needs the most, and how can we deal with that? How can we serve that part of you?
Yeah.
And let's figure this out together.
Yeah.
And if we're doing it together, we're no longer enemies. We're no longer opposing forces. We're teammates. We're brothers. We're sisters. We're in this together. We have a common goal.
Yeah. And just that question, it seems like, shifts that sense. If I am seeing you as other and the other asks me what I need, I get confused, right? It's hard for me to have two of those realities at once, right? Like you're the other and you're asking me for what I need. And it feels like what you're talking about is just this level of, how do we build trust between two people? How do we build trust amongst ourselves and with our own relationship to ourselves? And then how do we build trust with another human being? And when we look at the killings that are happening, you basically see people who probably don't have any sense of trust, and the fear is guiding them and controlling them. And we can all relate. You know, what I love about your Eldra is, like, whatever happens in the world, anybody does anything, you're like, I can relate to that. I've never had an experience where you're just like, I can't relate to that. You're like, I can relate to that fear that feels like people are going to attack me and I got to protect myself. I can relate to all of it. And I've always appreciated about you this, like, whatever's going on in the world, or whatever somebody does, whether it's a lovely, beautiful act or a really harsh act, you seem to make it a commitment to yourself to be able to not other them, and to be like, I can see that part of me. Yeah.
That helps me be able to, number one, be in relationship with myself. I got to know what's going on with me before I can start looking at what's going on with somebody else. I'm not smart enough, and I'm not God. I'm not equipped with the things to figure out what's going on with somebody else. What I have control over and what I can do is figure out what's going on with me. And the more that I'm in relationship with myself, the better equipped that I am to be present with you.
Yeah. And so when you hear of some of these atrocities that happen, do you tap into that part of you that could do that same thing, or that would
most
live in
certainly.
that fear? Yeah. So
most
if you
certainly.
fear, that is a capacity. It may not be something you act on, but it's a capacity that we all have. That when we both the goodness and the pain or the hurt, and that in that we can kind of like find what's true for us. We find our true selves. And I think you're such an amazing model of this personal responsibility, but it's a personal responsibility that like feels like that it's about connection. This is what I get from you. Like, it's personal responsibility, but it's also realizing the connections that we share. We just have a few minutes left, so I'm just wondering, what do you want to leave us with today? Anything we didn't cover, or wish we had covered more, or thing that you feel like could be highlighted a little bit?
What I would leave everyone with is an invitation to ask yourself that question: what do you need? What do you need? And sit with that and really look at that and find those parts of yourself that are in need. You know, I'll be 50 years old this year, and there are still 7-year-old parts of myself running around inside that need things.
Yeah.
And they need attention, and they need love, and they need freedom, and they need to know that they are safe to be integrated into the whole that is myself. So go find a mirror, look in it, and ask yourself, what do you need?
That's beautiful. And if people are interested in kind of following your work, insidecircle.org, is it?
InsideCircle.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We have a podcast now hosted by myself, the Inside Circle Podcast. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, and find what works for you.
Yeah. And I was on your podcast, which was a great joy. And I've never been asked such deep and heartful and direct questions. So I know you do everything you do with a lot of authenticity, and you really get to the heart of things. And a deep bow to you, Eldra, for your work. And thank you for joining us. And I was looking at chats, and people are like, I wish this could continue for a couple hours. But we have 30 minutes today, and we'll bring you back, and just deep bow to you and your work. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Soren. It's always an honor and a pleasure. Whenever you need me, call, and I'm coming.
All right. And I know you're doing a breakout today too, right?
We have a breakout at 10
Eldra,
a.m. this morning.
Check in about 30 minutes. You can check the attendee guide, and you can spend some more time with them. All right. I'll pass it back over to Michelle. Thank you again, Eldra.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Eldra and Soren.